Reminding us of the importance of the preferential option for the poor, Pope Francis says, "This is why I want a church which is poor and for the poor." They have much to teach us. Not only do they share in the sensus fidei, but in their difficulties, they know the suffering Christ. We need to let ourselves be evangelized by them. The new evangelization is an invitation to acknowledge the saving power at work in their lives and to put them at the center of the Church's pilgrim way. We are called to find Christ in them, to lend our voices to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them. I'm Gina Wolfe. I'm an associate professor of Catholic Theological Ethics here at CTU. I want to say this passage from Evangelii Gaudium gives us a lot to reflect on. I want to just focus on three of the challenges that Pope Francis presents us in this section. The first is the challenge to allow ourselves to be evangelized by the poor. The second is the challenge to listen to the poor. And the third is the challenge to lend our voice to their cause. So let's start with the challenge to allow ourselves to be evangelized by the poor. How can that happen? If we're afraid of the poor? If we have stereotypes or caricatures of the poor? If we keep our distance from the poor? It's really pretty hard to empathize with someone if you don't know them, if the person is a stranger. So I think that really presents a problem for us and points to our hesitancy to get to know strangers, to get to know people who are different from us. Let me tell you a story. I lived in Hong Kong a number of years ago, and I was working with the Maryknoll Sisters for a bit. I was helping them with a grant application for funding for the visiting nurse service that they had started in Hong Kong. And mainly the service was for the many refugees that were coming down from China. It was the end of the Cultural Revolution, and there were still refugees streaming in. I was asked one day to go with the nurses to see exactly what it was they did so that we could write this grant. So I thought, oh, all right, I've got to go. But I was a bit hesitant, I have to admit. The housing estates were known as dangerous places. And here I was, a young expatriate wife and mother, being invited to this dangerous place that I was sure was dirty and smelly, with people who were probably very cautious and kept themselves behind locked doors, that sort of thing. Well, needless to say, when I arrived there, it certainly wasn't like that at all. There's nothing fancy about the housing estates, that's for sure. But people had a pride about their home. They were clean, we were welcomed, they were so hospitable and open, couldn't do anything without first having tea. And in a case where there was someone really quite ill at home who needed the services of the nurses that I was accompanying. So I remember reflecting on my way home that evening, would I do that? Would I just open my home to a stranger who I didn't know and be that welcoming and hospitable? I'd like to think that I would, but I'm not so sure that that's really the case. So I think this challenge to allow ourselves to evangelize, that means we have to get to know other people, people who are different from us, strangers to us, is really difficult for many of us. So the second point that I want to talk about is this challenge to listen to the poor. And I think listening is difficult in general. It's much easier to hear what somebody has to say, but not really listen to them and respond on an equal footing with them. Not to have our own tape going while they're speaking, but to really be present to them. When I think about listening, really listening to the voices of the other, of the stranger, I'm always reminded of Julia Dinsmore. It's a woman who lives in Minnesota who I got to know when she came to speak to one of my classes when I was teaching up there. And she came to talk about some of the systemic problems with poverty and the poor. She had managed to get herself off welfare. She had been the third generation in her family on welfare, and she managed to get off of welfare and provide a home for herself and her children, and was very involved in advocacy work for the poor. So she came to talk about it. But what I always remember about that is not so much what she had to say about those structures, but the poem that she read to the class that she herself had written. And it's called "I'm Not Those People." And it was really a personal reflection. It was a personal reflection on her experience of being present in a room of people discussing what the needs of the poor were, what challenges there were to overcome some of the structural obstacles. And they would talk about those people, and they would describe their needs, etc. But she was there in the room, and they just spoke over her. And she said she always felt labeled as those people who are ignorant, who are a problem, who are lazy, etc. So that's always stuck with me. And actually the poem is online. You can just Google the title, "I'm Not Those People." So Julia Dinsmore taught all of us a lot that day about respecting others and being attentive to their presence and not speaking about them, even if they're not in the room, in a way that objectifies them. So this challenge that Pope Francis gives us to listen is also, I think, a formidable one. Finally, I want to talk about the challenge to lend our voices to the causes of the poor. And here, for me, this is a question of charity and justice, about the systemic problems. How do we help the voiceless have a voice? Obviously, knowing them is one step. Listening to them is clearly a second step. But being able to speak for them also is important. But we tend sometimes to get a little mixed up with this charity and justice and the difference between them. And what I always recall, again, my students, I always learn a lot from them. I had a class once on the theology of social action, and we had done a lot of reading of the lives of people who are in service to others. And it ranged from Mother Teresa to Dorothy Day. Quite a range. So toward the end of the semester, we're in groups in class, and I had drawn on the board this spectrum with charity at one end and justice at the other end. And each of the groups were to decide where to place all of the various individuals whose lives we'd been studying. So one group asked to be last. Okay, fine, not sure why, but they wanted to be last. Nobody seemed to mind. So all the other groups came up and they put Mother Teresa closer to charity, and Dorothy Day was closer to justice and systemic change and that sort of thing. And the last group got up and said, "We don't like your line. It's too linear. Justice and charity are not juxtaposed to each other. We need both." And they drew these footprints on the blackboard, left, right, left, right. And they said, not only do we need both of them, but they have to be coordinated, just as we need to be coordinated when we walk or we fall down. And I thought, oh, and they were right. So again, I learned a lot, and I've never used the spectrum again, but it reminds us of the need to think about how we respond, that we need to know the poor, we need to listen to the poor, we need to meet their immediate needs. But we also have to work for systemic change. And both of these are very challenging, because to be evangelized by the poor, which means to know them, to listen to them, and to work for their causes, pushes us, I want to argue, out of our comfort zone. It puts us in places that we might be afraid to go. And we can be afraid for a lot of reasons. We're afraid because we don't know them, and things we don't know can be frightening. Or maybe we're afraid because they might challenge us. We might have to change the way we live our lives. It's difficult, I think, to really listen. So I find this passage from Pope Francis's exhortation really very challenging, and one I hope that I'll have enough courage to maybe address and meet in a small way.